I can't believe it's been more than a decade since this happened. Time really flies if you're not paying attention. This story is probably one of the strangest experiences of my life, and back then, it was terrifying. At the time, I had recently started seeing my girlfriend. Because of our busy schedules, we barely spent time together. I was in my early 20s when all this happened, and all I wanted was to be with her. But finding a moment alone with her seemed impossible. We both lived with our families, so privacy was non-existent. We hadn't been dating long, but I was already frustrated. Felt like she always had plans, and I was just an afterthought. One weekend, I told her how I felt, and she apologized, saying she already had a camping trip planned with her friends. She felt bad that we couldn't spend time together again. I was upset and on the verge of ending things before they got too serious. Later that day, she texted me, saying her friend offered to let me join if I wanted. I didn't like camping, but I didn't want to miss a chance to be with her. The campsite was only about 45 minutes from where I lived, so I packed a bag and headed over. The place was odd, more like a big, open field surrounded by trees, filled with other campers. It didn't feel like the real camping I imagined, but I shrugged it off and focused on meeting her friends. Her friends were great, fun, loud, and outgoing, unlike my girlfriend, who was quieter and more reserved. They had an awesome sense of humor, and I started to enjoy myself. While hanging out, I noticed several trails leading into the woods. When I explored a bit, I realized how large the area was, and it finally felt like the camping I'd pictured. That evening, we grilled food on a portable grill and played card games. When night fell, we drank beers discreetly, hiding them in special cups since alcohol wasn't technically allowed. Around 11 p.m., 2 people came over to our campsite. I guess they were park officials or something. They shone their flashlights aggressively and demanded to know why we were still awake. We were confused. One of my girlfriend's friends spoke up sarcastically, saying, "Why wouldn't we be awake? It's our vacation." One of the officials snapped, "There's a strict curfew here. Lights out by 10 p.m. We thought it was a joke and laughed, but the official didn't budge. When another friend complained about paying for the campsite, the woman got even angrier. She yelled, "If I catch you awake, you're out of here." Frustrated, we all retreated to our tents. Someone suggested we quietly play cards in one tent, but the official must have overheard. She barked, "Lights out means lights out. No cards, no talking. Go to bed." It was ridiculous. We felt like kids being scolded. But since we'd been drinking, no one wanted to risk being kicked out and having to drive. Eventually, everyone fell asleep, except my girlfriend and me. We were savoring our rare time together. That's when she suggested something bold, sneaking onto one of the trails for some real privacy. I agreed immediately. We quietly slipped out of the tent and headed onto a trail. It was dark and peaceful, and for a while it was just the two of us. But the quiet didn't last. Out of nowhere, a man's voice called out, "Hey!" We froze, unsure of what to do. The voice called again, "I know you're there. I just want to say hi." Confused and uneasy, I peeked around a tree. Standing on the trail was a strange man with a flashlight. He was short, wearing an oversized shirt, and looked off. He noticed me and grinned. "Hey, buddy, I've got something for you," he said. I didn't respond. Then he added something bizarre. "I've got all this cash, and my ex-wife's trying to take it. I want to give it away before she finds it. Come get it." He held out his hand, but there was nothing in it. He stood about 20 feet away, thankfully not too close. I looked at my girlfriend and mouthed, "Run." As soon as she took off, I followed. The man shouted, "No," and lunged in my direction, but I was already sprinting. We ran back to the campsite, hearts pounding. Once there, we waited an hour for the officials to patrol before telling them about the man. I lied. saying I'd seen him from the tent, and they believed me. They contacted the authorities, and that was the last we heard about him. The rest of the night, I couldn't stop watching the woods, expecting him to reappear. Thankfully, he didn't. To this day, I have no idea what he wanted, but his strange grin and the way he lunged at us still haunt me. Every time camping season rolls around, I remember that eerie encounter and feel grateful we escaped unharmed. I'm writing this just hours after what I can only describe as one of the most bizarre experiences of my entire life. I know that sounds a little over the top, but in the moment, it truly felt surreal. My family and I had just arrived at our campsite for the weekend, and I can't shake this uneasy feeling, constantly glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Deep down, I think we're safe, but I'm still on edge. So bear with me as I recount this event. I'm putting it all down for the first time, and it's still fresh in my mind. Late last night, we left our home to kick off a long-awaited camping trip. It was something my wife and I had done many times before, but this was the first time we were bringing our 2 kids along. We'd waited until they were old enough to truly enjoy and remember the experience. With everything packed and ready, we hit the road for the 7-hour drive just after midnight. At first, the kids were wide awake, buzzing with excitement, and the car turned into an impromptu karaoke session. But not long after, the singing faded, and everyone except me dozed off. That was fine by me. It gave me a chance to catch up on an audiobook I'd been meaning to finish. By the time we were nearing the campsite, I realized the rest of the family had slept through most of the trip, waking only occasionally to groggily ask where we were. With just about 40 minutes left to go, disaster struck. The unmistakable thud of a flat tire jolted me out of my focus, and the car wobbled as I quickly steered it to the side of the road. It was a blow I hadn't anticipated, especially so close to our destination. Fortunately, I had a spare tire, so while it was frustrating, it wasn't a catastrophe. I carefully got out of the car, trying not to wake anyone as I started digging through the luggage in the trunk to get to the tools. As I worked on replacing the flat, I couldn't help but wonder what had caused it. The road seemed clear, and the tire failure felt suspiciously sudden. I brushed off the thought and focused on getting the spare installed. I was almost finished tightening the lug nuts when I heard someone lightly clear their throat. It startled me, and for a split second, I thought it might be my wife. But when I turned, I saw a short woman standing there, her hair in unkempt twists, and a vine tattoo winding up from the base of her neck. "Hi there," she said softly. "Need some help?" Her tone was friendly, almost too polite, but something about the situation felt off. I smiled awkwardly and replied, "Oh, thanks, but I think I've got it covered." She didn't move, just stood there, glancing repeatedly toward the darkness on the other side of the road. Every time I looked in that direction, I saw nothing, but her persistent glances made my stomach tighten. She continued to offer help, her voice unnervingly calm and sweet, but I kept refusing, trying to stay polite while speeding up my work. As I packed up my tools and prepared to leave, she suddenly said, "You really should let me help you." Her voice, now lower and harsher, sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, she took a step closer and hissed, "Let me help you." The shift in her demeanor was unnerving. Gone was the kind, soft-spoken stranger. In her place stood someone angry and menacing. I'd had enough. "Look, lady," I said firmly, my voice louder than intended. "You need to leave. My family's in the car, and I'm not in the mood for games. If you don't go, I'll call the police." My tone must have surprised her, but instead of leaving, she started laughing. A cold, unsettling sound. Ignoring her, I turned back to the car, opened the driver's side door, and dropped the keys in the cup holder, ready to start the engine as soon as I got in. When I turned to grab the wrench I'd left by the flat tire, I caught sight of her swinging something heavy at me, a lug wrench. She was uncoordinated, and I managed to block the blow with my arm. Without thinking, I kicked her in the leg, sending her stumbling to the ground. She groaned, then scrambled to her feet and bolted toward the side of the road she'd been eyeing earlier. I didn't wait to find out where she went. Heart pounding, I jumped into the car, started it, and sped off, glancing constantly in the rearview mirror. The remaining half hour of the drive felt endless, but thankfully, there were no more incidents. My wife woke as we reached the campsite, and when I told her what had happened, she was furious that I hadn't called the police immediately. She contacted them as soon as we arrived, providing every detail I could remember about the woman, her appearance, and the location of the encounter. Now that we're settled at the campsite, I can't shake the feeling that she might try to find us. She must have noticed the camping gear in our truck. Was she behind the flat tire? I don't know. I have no proof, but I can't stop wondering what her real intentions were. Did she want the truck, our belongings, or something worse? For now, I'll try to focus on enjoying the trip with my family. But if anything new happens or the police update us, I'll share it. Until then, I hope I never see that woman or her vine tattoo again. There's a reason I have to be convinced every time someone suggests a camping trip, whether it's friends or family. It's not that I dislike the outdoors or nature. I just prefer sleeping in a proper bed rather than on the ground in a tent. That year, my boyfriend managed to talk me into a camping trip, but he sweetened the deal by suggesting we stay in a cabin so I could sleep comfortably. I still voted for a beach vacation, but at least this plan included a bed. Our group consisted of my boyfriend, me, and 2 other couples. The 6 of us found a cozy cabin in a wooded area that was mostly isolated, with a scenic lake only about 100 yards away. To my surprise, I was actually getting excited about the trip, especially once we arrived. The first day was perfect. We spent the day exploring trails, swimming in the lake, and later grilling steaks for dinner. By the time night fell, I was feeling pretty content. We all went to bed around midnight, but I didn't sleep well. All night, I thought I heard noises outside. I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, we were in the woods, and strange sounds weren't exactly unusual. The next morning, while we were preparing for a hike, we suddenly heard a cheerful voice call out from behind us. "Good morning. How's everyone doing today?" My boyfriend, ever the social one, immediately started chatting with the man. He introduced himself as Dale and claimed to be familiar with all the local trails. His presence was a little odd but not alarming. Dale said he lived nearby, had heard us talking, and wanted to check if we were settling in. It seemed thoughtful at first. Dale was tall, probably over 6 feet, with a stocky build. He wore jeans, hiking boots, and carried a backpack, looking like your average outdoorsy local. After chatting briefly, he laughed in a jolly way and headed off down a trail. We joked about the encounter for a while during our hike. Later that afternoon, we went to the lake for some swimming and sunbathing. As we sat on the dock, soaking up the sun, we suddenly heard the same voice. "There you are." Startled, we turned to see Dale standing at the edge of the dock. When we asked what he was doing there, he shrugged and said he was just passing by and noticed us. My boyfriend took it in stride and chatted with him again, but I felt uneasy, as did my friend Kara's boyfriend. Dale's constant glances around while they talked didn't help matters. He eventually wandered off, mumbling to himself as he left. That evening, we gathered around the campfire to tell spooky stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My unease only deepened when Dale suddenly leaped out of the bushes, shouting, "Here I am!" before laughing loudly. We all jumped in fright, and my boyfriend, now visibly annoyed, told Dale off. He explained that sneaking up on us like that wasn't funny and warned him to leave us alone. Dale looked upset, muttering that he'd only wanted to make our trip more exciting, before disappearing down a trail. The mood was ruined, and we called it a night soon after. Inside the cabin, we cleaned up in preparation for leaving the next morning. Lying in bed, I confessed to my boyfriend that I had a bad feeling about Dale. I couldn't help but wonder if the noises I'd heard the previous night had been him. That night, I struggled to sleep again. At some point, I clearly heard footsteps and heavy breathing outside the window. Panicking, I woke my boyfriend, who reluctantly got up to check. His face went pale as he whispered that someone was outside, pacing back and forth, and it looked like Dale. I peeked cautiously. Dale was muttering to himself, pacing, and occasionally hitting his head with his hands. He tried the cabin door but found it locked, then became visibly upset, striking his head harder. After a few minutes, he disappeared into the woods. Terrified, we called the cabin owner and then the police. When an officer arrived, we recounted everything, including Dale's strange behavior. The officer seemed indifferent, as if he didn't grasp the seriousness of the situation. We stayed up until dawn, packed our things, and left as soon as the sun rose. Driving down the main road, we spotted Dale walking along the side, still mumbling and hitting his head occasionally. We reported his location to the police before continuing home. I don't know if they ever found him or what his intentions were, but I'm glad nothing worse happened. From now on, camping trips are off my list. About 5 years ago, my partner and I went on a trip to New Mexico. I'm not sure how she always does it, but she found this amazing campsite for us. Whenever I try to plan something, it's usually a disaster, which is one of the reasons I adore her. She always has a solid plan and helps me stay on track. I tend to be indecisive, so her practicality balances me out. This camping spot allowed us to set up wherever we wanted. I drove our SUV to what felt like the ideal location, and we started preparing everything: our tent, grill, some music, and other essentials to make this trip unforgettable. We had planned to stay 5 nights, but sadly, we only managed 3. If you had experienced what we did on the 3rd night, you'd probably have left early too. The first 2 days were wonderful. Unlike most camping locations in the US, this area was vastly different. Growing up on the East Coast, I associated camping with dense forests, serene lakes, and horror movie vibes. Here, though, it was all about rugged mountains, dry terrain, and a type of plant life I wasn't familiar with. I fell in love with the landscape instantly and made it a point to savor every moment. What made this trip even more special was how secluded it was. In 3 days, we didn't see another soul. While that might unsettle some people, it was perfect for us. Then came the 3rd night, the one we'll never forget. The day started off just as great as the others. We hiked some nearby trails, and by the evening, we were more worn out than usual. We decided to call it an early night and climbed into the tent around 9 p.m. I remember checking my phone for the time before quickly drifting off to sleep, as did my wife. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to her shaking me. Concerned, I asked her what was wrong. She put her finger to her lips, signaling me to stay quiet, and pointed outside the tent. I tried to listen, but at first, I couldn't hear anything. Then, she whispered that she thought there was an animal nearby. I chuckled softly, thinking it was endearing that she was worried about an animal. Looking back, it was naive of me. Plenty of creatures in that region could harm us if they felt threatened. I began listening more closely and finally heard it. A low growl. It wasn't like any growl I'd ever heard before. It wasn't deep and menacing like a bear's. It sounded faint and strange, almost like something imitating a growl. For a moment, I wondered if it might be a sick animal. Then, I remembered an article about rabid coyotes attacking people, and my heart raced. The footsteps outside sounded light, suggesting it wasn't very large, but I didn't want to take any risks. When the sounds moved a bit farther from the tent, I quietly unzipped it and told my wife to head to the SUV. Once the zipper was open, we saw nothing, so we quickly made our way to the vehicle. I unlocked the doors and we jumped in, locking them behind us. From inside, we scanned the area through the tinted windows, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had been outside. Minutes passed and nothing appeared, no movement, no sounds. But we both knew something had been there. The growling and footsteps were too clear to dismiss. Just as my wife started to drift back to sleep, I jolted her awake with a scream. What I saw wasn't an animal, it was a person. A disheveled man with long, wild hair and a scruffy beard. He was hunched over, growling the same eerie sound we'd heard before. My initial reaction was anger. I was ready to confront him, but before I could act, the situation escalated. From the shadows near our campsite, 3 more figures appeared. They moved toward our tent, whispering and laughing quietly. 3 of them carried large sticks, or at least that's what they looked like. Without warning, one of the men raised his stick high above his head and smashed it down onto our empty tent. He shouted something, probably thinking we were still inside. Adrenaline kicked in and I started the engine. We sped off without looking back, leaving the tent and everything behind. My only focus was getting as far away as possible. Once we reached a spot with cell service, my wife called the authorities. She explained what had happened and was later contacted by someone in law enforcement, likely a ranger or park official. We never returned for our belongings, and the park charged us a fee for abandoning our gear and cutting our reservation short. While the officers were sympathetic, the campground's management showed no concern and stuck to their policies. In the end, it was a small price to pay for our safety. I hope those men were caught and prevented from terrorizing anyone else. A few years ago, when my wife was still my girlfriend, we decided to take an unplanned camping trip. I didn't have much camping experience aside from a couple of trips with a buddy, but my girlfriend used to camp often with her family when she was younger and was eager to relive the experience. She thought it would be a perfect way for us to spend time together away from the hustle and bustle of the city where we lived. She went all out and bought a bunch of new camping gear, including a spacious tent that seemed oversized for just the 2 of us. I didn't mind, it gave us extra room, which was welcome since I was a larger guy back then. One thing I appreciated about the tent, which I later learned is standard with most tents, was a small window that allowed us to peek outside. I liked the idea of being able to look out at night and have sunlight stream in to wake us in the morning. We arrived at a remote camping spot in the afternoon. Since we were only staying 2 nights, we wanted to make the most of the trip. That first afternoon was pretty low-key. We set up our tent, relaxed a bit, and went to bed early. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I admired the view through the tent's little window. The clear night sky was stunning, full of stars. The next morning, as expected, sunlight poured through the window, gently waking us. It felt oddly comforting, almost like waking up at home. We got up early, made breakfast, and spent the day hiking, fishing, and relaxing in the sunshine. It was a perfect mix of activity and calm, and we felt ready for another early night. That evening, we settled into the tent, cozy and tired from the day's adventures. I propped open the little window screen to enjoy the view. As I started drifting off, something outside caught my eye. Movement, maybe? I couldn't tell if I had imagined it, but before I could focus, my girlfriend whispered, "Did you see that?" I told her I thought I had seen something, but I wasn't sure. We both sat up, peering out the window. At first, everything seemed normal, a peaceful, quiet night. Then my girlfriend suddenly gasped, and the sound chilled me. Her expression was one of pure fear, something I'd never seen on her before. About 30 or 40 feet away, perched on a tree branch, was a person. They wore a strange, fake mask, like the kind of mask meant to look like a famous face. The figure was casually swinging their legs, almost like a child playing on a swing. We froze. Until that moment, we hadn't seen a single person in the area, and now this masked figure was so close to us. My heart raced. I wanted to cry but held it in, trying to stay strong since my girlfriend was already in tears. The person wasn't doing anything directly to us, but their presence alone was deeply unsettling. We watched them for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably about 5 minutes. Then suddenly they jumped down from the tree. The figure didn't approach the tent, but they started pacing around slowly, as though deciding what to do next. The whole time, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, convinced they might charge toward us at any second. Then they stopped moving entirely, standing motionless like a statue. After a couple of minutes, the person turned to face the tent. Even with the mask on, it felt as though they were staring directly at us. Then we heard muffled laughter from under the mask. The person raised a hand and began waving, an exaggerated, frantic motion as if they were trying to shake their arm loose. Just as abruptly, the waving stopped. In a muffled voice, they called out, "Bye, guys," before sprinting at full speed into the woods, disappearing from view. We sat there, wide-eyed, unable to process what had just happened. We stayed awake most of the night, occasionally dozing off but mostly staring out of the tent's little window, listening for any sounds. The masked person never returned, and by morning, there was no sign they had ever been there. No footprints, no trail, nothing. The scariest part was realizing that whoever it was had been watching us for an unknown amount of time. They could have been in that tree for minutes or hours before we noticed. Though we were physically unharmed, the experience left us shaken for a long time. We've gone camping a few times since, but now we stick to cabins with secure doors. That unsettling encounter is something neither of us will ever forget. Many people dislike city life, but I'll take the hustle and bustle over the wilderness any day, especially after what happened to me and my friends about a year ago. One of my friends had recently ended her long-term relationship of 6 years, and she wasn't handling the breakup well, which I completely understood. Another friend of ours, who loves the outdoors, suggested we take a break and spend a night camping in the woods. To our surprise, our newly single friend agreed. We rented a cozy little cabin deep in the forest for a night. I was actually excited to have a girls' getaway that didn't involve the city's nightlife or dressing up. But, as I predicted, our heartbroken friend got bored shortly after we arrived. She started looking up nearby spots and found a small bar in a nearby village. She convinced us to go, and honestly, I joked that this was more my style of camping. The bar had a simple charm with only a handful of locals. While we were there, our recently single friend struck up a conversation with a man sitting alone. He was older than us but had a rugged kind of attractiveness. Whether it was the drinks or her emotions, she ended up flirting with him quite a bit. After a while, she left his company and told us she was ready to head back to the cabin. On our way back, we teased her about her bar friend, and she just laughed it off, insisting it wasn't serious. Back at the cabin, we poured some wine, but it was clear we weren't cut out for rustic living. The lack of internet and entertainment made it painfully boring. Though the effort to cheer her up was sweet, this plan wasn't working for any of us. We decided to sleep in the living room together, one on the couch, one on a love seat, and one in a recliner. It didn't take long for us to fall asleep. Sometime after 3 a.m., I was woken by one of my friends nudging me. She looked frightened and whispered that she'd heard the doorknob rattling. I thought she was imagining things, but then I heard it too. Someone was outside, aggressively trying to open the door. Terrified, we huddled together on the couch, listening. The cabin was small, and we could hear whoever it was moving around outside, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. They walked around the entire cabin, and soon we heard them behind us near a large window. The faint sound of someone fiddling with the window latch sent chills through us. Summoning courage I didn't know I had, I shouted, "I'm calling the police!" The noise stopped, and then, to our horror, a man's voice softly called out our friend's name. It was the same name she had told the man at the bar. I yanked open the curtain, and there he was, the man she'd spoken to earlier. He froze like a deer in headlights, his hands raised as if to say he meant no harm. Then, without a word, he bolted into the darkness. We immediately called the police and reported what happened. Though the officers came and checked the area, they didn't find anything. We packed up and left as soon as they were gone. On the drive home, we started piecing things together. We'd returned to the cabin well before midnight, and this man didn't try breaking in until hours later. That meant he must have followed us, waited for us to fall asleep, and then tried to get in. The realization that he had been lurking outside all that time made us sick. We later found out that the window he was trying to open had been unlocked. If my friend hadn't woken up when she did, who knows what might have happened. Oddly enough, the ordeal gave our friend a new perspective. She was so grateful we escaped unharmed that it helped her start moving forward after her breakup. "15 years ago, back when I was around 12, my parents let me invite two of my best friends over for a backyard campout. They set up a tent, and my mom stocked up on snacks while my dad ordered pizza and drinks before heading out for a dinner date. We were thrilled about our little camping adventure and brought as much food as possible into the backyard. We spent the evening chatting and munching, planning scary stories and roasting marshmallows later in the night. After eating our fill, we started gossiping about our school crushes and whether we'd work up the courage to ask them to dance at the next school event. Inside the tent, we tried to build a cozy fort with blankets and pillows, but nothing stayed up the way we wanted. The whole time, I kept thinking I heard noises outside. I unzipped the tent's window to check but saw nothing. A few minutes later, one of my friends mentioned hearing something brushing against the tent. Audrey peered through the open window and asked, "Do you see that black shape over there?" I squinted and suddenly noticed a small white mark, almost like a Nike logo, darting in the shadows. That's when I screamed, and the others joined in. We bolted into the house and locked ourselves in the bathroom. Huddled together, we tried to stay quiet, but then we heard footsteps. The doorknob jiggled, and we shrieked. Audrey grabbed her phone and called the police, but just as she started explaining, my mom's voice called out for us to come out. When we opened the door, my parents were there, and my dad sheepishly admitted it was just him playing a prank. "Sorry, girls," he said, taking the phone to assure the dispatcher it was a misunderstanding. Being from a small town where my dad knew everyone, the police never showed up. Though we were furious at first, we couldn't stay mad for long. My dad, ever the jokester, made it up to us by helping with esmores and even offering to get anything we needed. Later, as we settled back into the tent, we chatted until one by one, we fell asleep. I stayed awake the longest, making sure my friends were comfortable. But I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night to the sound of heavy breathing. At first, I assumed it was one of my friends snoring, but the sound grew louder. When I sat up, I found myself eye level with the tent window. A flash of movement sent chills down my spine, and then I heard the tent zipper being pulled. Thinking it was my dad again, I groaned, "Dad, cut it out. You already scared us once." But the voice that answered wasn't his. It was deeper, almost a growl. "How do you know it's me?" Frozen with fear, I grabbed my friends and dragged them out of the tent. We ran straight into the house and woke my parents. My dad immediately went outside, shouting at whoever it was, then came back in and called the police. He waited outside until the officers arrived. When he returned, he explained that a man had been causing trouble in the area, but thankfully, they caught him. My dad apologized profusely for scaring us earlier and asked if my friends wanted to call their parents. Audrey stayed, but our other friend decided to head home. Audrey and I moved our campout into the living room. My dad built us a blanket fort, and we stayed up for a little while before finally falling asleep. The next morning, my parents made us a big breakfast, and we spent the day by the pool, which was just what we needed to shake off the previous night's fright. Audrey and I are still close friends today, but we've never gone camping again since that night.